Hello everyone, Paul from Novus here. I trust you're enjoying our World Architecture Day interview series. So far we've heard from Koichi Takata and Fariborz Hatton. Today, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to my friend, David Hillam from Hillam Architects.
Welcome back to the Novus World Architecture Day interview series. Our guest today is David Hillam, owner and principal of Hillam Architects based in Perth. The practice has more than 20 years experience designing at every scale, from multi-residential to mixed use, commercial and high-end houses. David himself has a passion for residential design, and the practice has amassed a large portfolio of apartment developments in Western Australia. David, welcome to the series.
Thanks, Linda. Really pleased to be here.
Now, you founded your practice in 1993, which is not that long into the last recession that Australia experienced. What was that like operating a fledgling practice at such a challenging economic time?
Yes, it was really a really interesting time. I actually had a unique, background to the way that my practice started. I managed to, despite the difficult times, pull together enough money to do a very small project, and I developed a duplex development. And from that, I was able to then, I generated a lot of inquiry. I'd been working in Japan for a couple of years, so I used some of the ideas and concepts that I experienced there into some small townhouses that I designed, and that actually led to the inquiry that led to the establishment of my practice. That, I think, was quite easy in a sense because I'd actually made some profit out of my little project, and that meant that the financial sort of risk was diminished. So if I didn't have too much work at that, I was able to sort of survive off the project that I'd done. So I guess it was unique in that sense, but also it was really helpful because that's what led to the inquiry that allowed me to establish the practice. Initially, I started from home and my costs were really low, so there wasn't a lot of risk there. And then I moved into a small office that allowed me to employ just one or two people, so not too many mouths to feed.
So from there, how did you go about procuring more work?
I did work, people came to me because they liked what I designed and they were looking for similar sorts of projects. And it really was just a case of very gradual and incremental growth. It was interesting, and I actually found that I was working for developers more than I was for individual house clients, whereas not too many years after that, we became much better known for just doing single houses, and our work was split equally between houses and small apartment projects. But it was, in fact, one of the builders that we'd used to construct the project that we'd designed. They actually then started to utilise us to help other clients of theirs. So it was really just a fairly organic process, and I think most practices do start that way. But as I said, I think I was really fortunate on the basis that I did have some financial backing before I made that sort of leap into private practice.
Yeah, it sounds like it just sort of had a snowball effect from those first one or two projects.
Yes, correct. And each of the projects I did subsequently, and I think my experience in Japan was really unique in that I gained an appreciation for compact and smaller houses. And this was a time in Perth where that was actually really unusual for people to live on more compact lots of land. And it was at the same time that the redevelopment authorities in Perth were actually starting to open up smaller inner city areas that actually had very small blocks by Perth standards. And because I had that background of dealing and designing in more confined spaces, I think that really stood me in good stead to do that sort of work. And I attracted people that actually could see the results, which is that you can actually achieve a fair amount on with less. So it was sort of a transformation in Perth, and it coincided with the fact that I had that experience in Japan that informed my design work at that time.
Yeah. So for this video series celebrating World Architecture Day, we're asking why architecture matters. Now, of course, there's no need to convince the profession of this, but how do you engage the average person on the street in why architecture should matter to them?
That's a great question. I think over the 25-year journey that I've been in practice, engaging in with the person on the street, as you put it, has been a real challenge. Perth is an incredibly remote city, and of course we can see what's happening elsewhere in the world as architects, but I don't think that necessarily the public here locally are necessarily exposed to it to the same extent. So we see all of the wonderful things happening, and we want to bring that back to Perth and deliver all of the great things that architecture can deliver. So it has been a challenge, I think, in communicating value, but ultimately it's really through people seeing the work that you do, and I guess the profession itself challenging each other by looking at each other's work locally, and I guess it builds from that point. But I think that what's been really fantastic over the last 5 to 10 years is that communication, whether it's the internet, Instagram, social media, and so forth, the communication of the value of design and the diversity of design around the world is much more accessible. So we do feel that the design appreciation now compared to even just 10 years ago has increased significantly, and that's really great for the profession, because it really means that architects are doing more work. And traditionally, for example, architects in Perth only deliver perhaps 4% of housing, and I believe that that percentage is actually increasing, and that's a really good thing for the environment and for the community.
Yeah, that's a great thing indeed. How do you communicate to your clients the value that architects bring?
The way that we communicate, more recently, we've been really successful in the apartment sector, which again is a new area in Perth, where the number of people living in apartments relative to other capital cities in Australia is really low. There's perhaps only 15% of the population living in apartments, compared to even a similar sized city such as Brisbane, where it might be closer to 30%. So what we really try to do is our clients who are predominantly in that sort of apartment sector, we really communicate that we understand that great design is going to differentiate their projects from other projects, and also that we have a really good understanding of the economics of the projects as well. So it's about achieving great outcomes within sometimes fairly constrained budgets, and also understanding where you can deliver the best results within those constraints. And so clients, I think, can look at the success of projects that you've built, and you explain to new clients, for example, why those projects were successful, because they might come to us as a new inquiry and like what they see in terms of the aesthetics of the building, and the fact that the building's perhaps sold really well, and people like the building, but also you need to explain to them there's much more to it than that. It's to do with the constructability, the efficiency in the design, and also really trying to understand who the end users of those projects are going to be. So if it's, for example, apartments, it's very easy for architects to perhaps accept a client brief without necessarily challenging it. So I think a part of that conversation with our clients is to explain to them that we're there to also challenge them to take on board what our brief is, but also to bring to them the experience that we've gained over the 25 years, which has been really interesting, because through each economic cycle and there's been differing sorts of emphasis. So apartments perhaps 10 years ago that we were designing were extremely large, and following the global financial recession, we found it just incredibly difficult to get projects to work economically. So that really challenged, I guess, our own perception of what we were designing. And we found that we had some projects where, for example, within the same building envelope, we managed to double the number of apartments, which made them, so much more affordable. And at that time, coming out of that recession, that was the dollar was the bottom line, and really important to people actually wanting to get to be able to afford to move into buying their own apartment at that particular time. So whereas now we're seeing that there's a much greater focus on the quality of the offering. So now we're seeing more baby boomers and downsizers who are very affluent people moving into apartments, so they don't necessarily want to compromise. And the reason they haven't traditionally made those moves is because they don't believe that there's actually been an offering that is commensurate with their their view of what they should have in their retirement, I guess. So it's really explained to your clients that you are thinking about all of those issues.
Yes, well, speaking of economic cycles, architecture as an industry can very often be quite sensitive to economic fluctuations. So, in your opinion, is what's happening now with the recession caused by the pandemic similar to what happened in the 1990s?
For my practice personally, it's actually really different, and it's probably because I have approximately 40 staff now, whereas back in the early 1990s, it was only myself and perhaps one or two other people in the practice. So from a personal level, very different, but also I think I can say that the pandemic is a totally different dynamic to a financial sort of recession because of the specifics of actually having to be separated, and the fact that we virtually sent our whole team home to work from home. So that's a really specific dynamic that you need to deal with. And clearly we had literally overnight, perhaps 2 or 3 of our projects put on hold, and we might have had 4 or 5 people attached to those projects that were working on them. So we had to manage that dramatic sort of halt, which was not that dissimilar more so to the global financial crisis, where our practice dropped from 25 staff down to approximately 12 in a matter of weeks. We felt like the canary in the coal mine when that sort of recession came through. The pandemic has been different for that. It's interesting. I mean, obviously the government support through the pandemic has been very helpful. We initially perhaps put 7 staff off, and we were able to bring 5 more of them back on because of that support very quickly, and they were able to do constructive things that were perhaps not, from our point of view, work that we could invoice our clients for, but certainly constructive work for our practice. So the pandemic has been really different. It's actually been great because it's allowed us to challenge the way that we work. And we are a collaborative office, and that's one of the things that we think is really good. But of course, collaborating through Zoom and so forth with your own team members and your clients is quite a different sort of experience. And it's really led to us to think about the way that we upgrade our infrastructure. And we managed to do that quite quickly, but also the way that we work, whether or not we do need to meet in person as often, take the trip to the city to meet our clients and so forth. It's really allowed us to challenge those sorts of behaviours, and also think more carefully about the flexibility we might offer our team going forward as a business, because some of us, we found some of our team adapted really well to working remotely, and some perhaps a little bit less so. So it's great to have that flexibility, but also to be able to offer it up.
Yeah, that's great indeed. The pandemic is obviously causing a lot of changes very rapidly. In terms of what's happening in the built environment, what do you think are some of the changes that could be here to stay?
Well, I think certainly we need to think much more carefully about what sort of we allow for in terms of working from home. So the home environment is really important. We tried to set up our team in a really the best way we possibly could by providing all of the equipment that they needed, but they also needed to look at their own spaces. So that's an interesting thing. I think people will definitely think about their workspaces at home as a result of the pandemic, because it's really important, the degree of comfort that you experience in your work environment. And I think certainly the comfort of being able to be at home is important, but also if you have younger children there with you and so forth, there's those types of challenges to deal with. So I think that in houses, we may well be giving those sort of workspaces in houses more thought. And certainly we're already talking about that with apartments that we design, that perhaps a study space, which might be just a nook, you might expand that to a greater extent to make it feel more functional to be used for longer periods of time, because often those spaces have been conceived as really as something that somebody might just use to do a few things, for 20 or 30 minutes in the evening, not to spend 8 hours there, so to speak. Clearly, the other area that's going to change is the workplace, because I think it's great that you feel that you don't need to have your whole team in the workplace at the same time. That might allow you to open up other areas in your workplace to other uses, whether it's offering more amenity or support to your staff, or creating just better spaces for having interactions such as these discussions we're having now. I'm in our main boardroom. We have 3 meeting rooms, but perhaps in the workplace we've designed that differently, having been through the pandemic.
Are you seeing a lot of changes in what clients are asking you?
Not specifically. We're sort of in some respects, and it's relatively early days. And in Perth, we've been extremely lucky that our work slowed down, but in fact now our work is basically back to pre-pandemic levels. But in terms of a brief from our clients, we haven't seen the question about what we might offer in an apartment in terms of workspace. That's certainly been discussed, but it's been perhaps driven by us. The other area that I think is worth thinking about is the way that people commute and travel. I think that we're definitely talking more about people not using public transport, perhaps some using bikes, cycling. So the quality of those spaces in the buildings we're designing have been given more consideration, more space given over to people that want to use other ways of commuting to work. That's definitely been a discussion point as well.
Yeah, so you've mentioned changes in the workplace, changes in the home environment, which obviously now the home environment is going to be so much more multi-purpose than it has been before. How do you integrate what could be seen as competing requirements into one cohesive design?
That's the challenge that architecture is because it's, as you say, there's so many competing requirements, and there's really the requirement of the larger social questions that I think we as architects need to turn our mind to, and that's sort of the joy of what we do. We have the economic challenges of making projects feasible, the changing brief that we would have, and as I said before, what we've really noticed is that the demographic that we're dealing with, the average age of people in our buildings is in some of our buildings is 65, and the percentage of owner occupiers can be as high as 90%. So there's some really interesting competing requirements, and that's what we need to turn our mind to as architects, is how can we really deliver the absolute best outcomes. So the spaces that we create and the way that they actually enhance people's lives, and beautiful spaces do actually really make a difference to people. And if people are aging in place, the quality of the spaces that they're in will, it actually has a potential to extend their lives and make their lives so much more meaningful. So that's, I think, is a challenge, is that when you have a brief perhaps from a client who's more focused on the financial outcomes, how do you also make sure that you deliver the things that are really important for the people that ultimately live in the buildings that you're designing, and enhance their lives? Interestingly, I've actually lived in 4 different apartment buildings that we've designed over the last 5 years, and I've sat on the Council of Owners, which is not always the easiest job to do as the architect, but it's really great to get the feedback from people that are living in the buildings in and around you, and you often have a very diverse group that, as I said, can be quite elderly, and then others that are obviously younger, and getting people to the feedback and what actually is really successful about what we've done, and things that perhaps people seem to be more negative about than what you would have anticipated. That's a great way to find out what we can do better and how we can really continue to create great spaces to live in.
And what sort of things do they tell you about?
It's interesting because I think particularly with people that are more affluent and have moved out of, say, a very large house and a large block, for them it's a real cultural change. So it's often about that and about their understanding of what apartment living is all about. And perhaps it's not for everybody, but it's issues. I was on the radio yesterday talking about acoustics. We've definitely rethought our offering on acoustics, because what had been acceptable for 20 years suddenly is much less acceptable, and had a lot to do with the demographic moving into those buildings and what their expectation was. So even though all our buildings have been design to code and so forth, we've now, as a result of me, I guess, living in those buildings and hearing that feedback about acoustics, we've really significantly re-looked at what we recommend to our clients in terms of the quality and the provisions in that space. But it's also around behaviours, the use of communal facilities and so forth. And of course, you're always going to get quite a diverse group of people that have different views about the way those spaces function.
What an interesting experience. I think more architects should live in the buildings that they've designed.
Yeah, I think they should, and I think probably a lot of architects do. And you need to take on board. I think that often people that are on these groups that are highly passionate about where they're living, they can give you some really helpful feedback. And as I said, things that you don't necessarily always expect to hear. But I agree. It's good to not to live in the buildings, do a really thorough post-occupancy sort of evaluation of what it is that you've created.
Yeah, definitely. You've mentioned before ageing in place, and obviously with what's going on in aged care, that's a very important challenge for architecture. But what do you think are some of the biggest challenges facing architecture at this time?
I think the biggest challenge, I sit on the National Practice Committee for the Institute of Architects, and a lot of what we talk about is the way that buildings are procured. And there was a time where the traditional role of architect was to be, I guess, the impartial person that maintains the control over the actual built outcome, whereas there's been, I think, an erosion of the architect's role in creating buildings where the architect is perhaps more so working for the builder as opposed to the builder working for the architect. And that change in dynamic, I'd say 80% of the projects we do aren't configured that way, but I think increasingly in the profession, more architects are novated to builders. And I think that it's this type of arrangement that's led to some of the building quality issues, because the builder, of course, is the one that's concerned about getting the building built for a particular budget, and the architect's not necessarily in that type of dynamic, able to have a say so much over those types of, I guess we might call them shortcuts that might be taken. So I think that's certainly a really big challenge for the profession, and also the expectation from people that finance buildings to apply the liability of the actual building to the architect, because it's not necessarily the architect that is in our view responsible for those liabilities. So in a practical professional sense, there's some real challenges currently just to do with that issue. And I think there's an opportunity for that to change, and certainly there's been some strong focus on issues such as building quality issues. I think the other challenge for architects is to rethink what they think their mandate is. And the Institute of Architects, I think, is leading this, and it's not so much a challenge, but something that we should be turning our mind to, and that is, what's our role in terms of the climate debate, the climate emergency, as some would say. What's our role in dealing with affordability and homelessness? There's certainly some really big challenges in those sort of areas, and I think that we should look at those challenges as something that we want to take on, and that we want to really help deliver a sort of a better planet and a better community. And see it as certainly our role to be interested in those things.
Yeah, some certainly very big challenges indeed. What do you think would be some of the opportunities that you can see on the horizon?
Well, it's a really exciting time for architecture, because the technology and the way that we view our work through digital visualization, production and so forth, it's really moved so much in the last sort of decade. And I think one of the greatest opportunities is that there is a possibility that architects can, in a sense, reassert themselves as being at the top of that, almost the production sort of process. So there's some really exciting things relating to parametric design. the way that buildings are built and manufactured. And there's certainly architects out there currently that are designing, in their office, and those designs are going directly to production through robotics and so forth. So it's an incredibly exciting time in that sense, in that we have the capacity to produce much more sophisticated designs because of the tools that we have at our disposal, but also the way that we construct buildings. I think that in the same way that for a long time, other things that we consume, such as cars and products, phones and so forth, the degree of development in those things has been incredible, and the production of those objects is highly automated, and that's what's going to be just the really amazing thing about architecture in the future, is the sort of components that we can actually manufacture, whether it's through 3D printing or simply straight to the factory type manufacture of really complex and sophisticated shapes without it involving the incredible labour that it may have sort of employed traditionally. So I think there's just some really amazing opportunities in architecture. The other thing that I think is going on is because of the incredible consumption of information through digital media, our capacity to sort of learn from each other is enhanced, and through that sort of accelerated capacity, I think that there'll be, as time has shown, an ongoing acceleration in relation to quality, but also and the sort of positive benefits that architecture can bring to the environment, but also the expectation of consumers and the public is becoming much more design focused, I think, and the opportunity for the profession is that we can absolutely pick up on that type of interest and enthusiasm that the public have for design and for things that are, of a great quality. And the thing that, we would like to see less of is the sort of philosophy. I think there's also a change and a move to quality as opposed to quantity. And in some respects, Perth is the home of quantity over quality, where, the number of rooms in your house is sort of a reflective of the status, not necessarily the quality of those spaces. It's literally the size. And I do see a real shift away from that sort of we want more to we just want better. And architects, I think, are really well placed to hopefully deliver on that opportunity.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we do see more of quality over quantity. And finally, the International Union of Architects has defined this year's theme for World Architecture Day to be toward a better urban future. Now, your practice has been involved in a lot of highly urbanised work. So in your experience, how do you think architecture can, as they say, make our communities strong, safe, equitable and affordable?
Yes, and I guess I touched on this a little bit in just earlier. I think we have a huge role that we can play in those things, and we also have a responsibility to contribute to safety, equity, and all of those points that you just made. We have a project in the office at the moment, which is one that we're doing with the Department of Communities, and the Department of Communities delivers social housing. And the site that they've given us it's an amazing site in Perth. It's in Fremantle. It has harbour views, which are highly sought after, and they're seen as very much a premium sort of offering. So we have this situation where private developer is joint venturing with the government to deliver social housing, affordable housing, and also there needs to be some sort of economic outcome as well. So there's premium housing there. So it's the most diverse offering of living arrangements that we've contemplated, and that will be across 5 buildings. So it's a great, hopefully exemplar project where you have what we would say is the most diverse mix of people in society. And our aim is to design a community that is cohesive and where you get real benefits right through the sort of different demographics that are going to be living in this project. And the reason that we were successful in bidding for the project was not so much, not all about the actual architecture, but also the way that we thought about the way that those spaces would be used, but also the way that they would work economically and the type of activities. So it's in a precinct in Fremantle where the arts community is quite strong. So we've really tried to build on that, and a part of the concept is to offer free space to artists so they have lived workspaces, and those spaces would that free tenure would be in exchanged for contribution to the community. So they'd actually contribute to the running of the buildings. And so we're really trying to think about different ways that the occupants of our buildings can actually integrate and also interact with each other, and what it is that they can do from a community sense, and what can be traded in the actual building fabric to get those community outcomes. The other thing that we've been really mindful about is the ongoing cost in terms of affordability. So the commercial sort of income that might be generated on that site, we resolved should be actually put back into the cost of running the strata. So when you talk affordability, often the focus is on the capital cost of buying a house. But what we were really interested in was also that we could minimise the ongoing maintenance and the ongoing costs for residents, so that it wasn't a case that you could afford to buy there, but you couldn't actually afford to continue to live there. So I think that as architects, it's really interesting to turn our mind to those things other than simply the built fabric, but the way that those community spaces interact and the way that you actually set up a community. And I think that we have the education and the capability to think about those things and deliver really, I think, excellent outcomes. And I really enjoy talking to local authorities about the dynamics of development, and what motivates developers is often that they can get more yield in their projects. And so because I do development work myself, I understand that economic reality. And so I've sort of put it to a number of local authorities, well, what is it that you can get back for the community on the basis that you're delivering better yields to people that are actually trying to build these areas? And the systems that have been come up with historically don't necessarily give the best outcomes. There might be a community meeting room in each building, which is not necessarily that useful. So, you know, what we've been able to do is have conversations and say, well, how can we actually expand what that offering is? And it doesn't necessarily have to be constrained just to the limitations of the particular site that we're designing on. What can we do outside the site that actually delivers a great outcome for the community and allows better accessibility and all the things that I think that we all know enhance spaces and deliver a more equitable environment.
Yeah, it sounds like a great project and a great private-public collaboration indeed.
Yeah, it's really exciting, and I think it's important that governments actually do sort of challenge the private sector to come up with ideas and the way that they can actually deliver better outcomes for the community. And that sort of assessment process where that's the mandate. It's about how can you deliver more, as opposed to can we get more money for this land on behalf of the government. That's not necessarily going to deliver the best outcome. So it's really great to see whether it's state or local governments starting to think about their communities in those terms. And we're seeing, again, a real trend in that area where that's becoming more the mandate than necessarily just the financial, let's call it the short-term financial outcome.
Well, David, it's been a pleasure talking to you today. Thank you for participating in this series.
Thank you very much. It's been great talking today. Thanks a lot.